right, sound is good, camera's good. All right, thanks a lot, guys. Okay, so I'm Joe. My handle's that can be hardware hacker or heavyweight hacker if we're worried about 400-pound hackers. A little small for that. All right, so I put this talk together for kind of two opposite reasons, and that is because all of us either fall into two categories. We're either interested in hardware hacking and want to do it, or we already do it and we like it and we're excited about it, or we want to teach it to someone else, right? Like we want to get other people excited about it and get our friends doing it or other people, right? So whichever end of that spectrum you're on, I figured it was kind of good to talk about, what has hardware hacking been, what might it be, and where it's going, how it evolves, where it is now, and what we need to be doing as like a call to action as hardware hackers, right? So it's kind of a basic talk, although it is also directed in a philosophical sense to those of us that are a little more advanced hardware hackers. And then I also wanted to leave a bunch of time for Q&A, or also kind of spitting out idea type of things, because as I pointed out here, I'm the founder of HackerBoxes, which I know a lot of you have probably stopped by and talked to us in the vendor area. But we make kits for hardware hackers, a new kit every month, and I think that can give an opportunity here for us to have a little bit of a Q&A conversation kind of thing, because we want to hear from people that are interested in hardware hacking or are doing it, or maybe even use our product, what type of things that you're interested in or want to work on in the future, and then also give you an opportunity to ask questions as to what we see being the cool new thing in DIY electronics and hardware hacking, and what we like about that, and how we see our hobby field kind of evolving. So. All right, so at the core of all hacking, really, but I think hardware hacking particularly, is this literary notion. I mean, it's a notion that's founded in literary field of the competent man. It can also be a competent woman, of course, but so this notion of the competent man is someone who can do things, right? So like we all have that friend who he gets a flat tire and he's got to call AAA. Not because he doesn't want to get his suit dirty, but because he does not know what a lug wrench is, right? We are not those people, right? Like I have little boys, and I tell them, when they break something, I'm like, we're not breakers, we're the fixers, right? So a competent person should be able to do things and should be able to make things and understand how things work and fix them and understand them at a level so that we can make new things out of them and not just use them, right? So anyone can use a smartphone, let's say. I see some smartphones here, but not many people can write an app or interface with the smartphone over Bluetooth or things like that. And to really kind of embrace, how do I do things and how do I change things and how do I engage with the world instead of just being a passive consumer. And it is really what the hacker ethos is all about. And hardware hackers take that to a whole new level, because we grab the stuff, the actual physical stuff, and change it, right? So I want to start by talking about the good old days of hardware hacking, because I think it's really important. In the theme of this DEF CON 25 was old school, new school, right? So want to have a look at what has been sort of the history of hardware hacking and the theme of it. This will be nostalgic for some people or historically educational for the youngsters. So probably some of the first areas of or a fundamental area of hardware hacking are people that are involved in amateur radio, right? In the very old days, there wasn't Facebook and there wasn't the web, and people weren't hacking Java. If you were interested in technology, what you were probably doing is making your own radio receiver and then your own radio transmitter. And you were putting up your own antenna and figuring out how different antennas work and communicating with other people. And and there was this whole amazing hobby, which has actually started becoming a little more popular again because of hardware hackers and because of the maker movement. This hobby of like actually making communications equipment and using it. And so, one could say this is like the original hardware hacking, was making your own antennas, making your own transmitters, right? So, anyone in here a ham? All right, good job here. That's good. All right, and then and then we moved into a phase where there were companies like Heathkit and then later Radio Shack, and there are some really great Australian companies that aren't coming to mind that I've heard about that just make really cool kits and get people involved in building things and really like bring the hardware technology right into people's hands and let them make things and work on things. So has anyone ever worked on a Heathkit or knows about a Heathkit? So these are like back, you can see it's kind of like in the 60s and 70s looking thing, but I know there were still some Heathkits around when I was a kid too. So. Right, and then coming into like the computer era, the very first personal computers, so the very first computers that everyday people got to play with in their homes or to actually own themselves, you had to actually build them. Like they were not it was not something you went to, Walmart and bought a computer. That didn't come around until a little later, but so like this was a very early computer that was an Altair, and we worked with these types of computers by getting right into the nitty-gritty of how the processing worked. You would actually input a byte, which would be like hitting a key on your keyboard, by setting the bits of that byte and then hitting store, and it would go into put it into memory location. So you're dealing with a computer right down at the hardware level, right? And then even the very earliest Apple computers, the Apple I was a kit, and you had to build it. This is an Apple II, which of course these came pre-built, but they still had all these slots. You could make boards and jam them in there and actually interface with the equipment. I know back in the early 80s we were still hooking things up to the joystick ports on these things. Even though it was a pre-made computer, there was still kind of this idea of the hardware is mine and I get to work on it, right? So and of course, just to keep it real hacker friendly, this is does anyone know what this is? Yeah, this is a blue box, and this is actually one that's featured in a museum. And people use these for phone phreaking. They would hardware hackers would make these and actually take over the phone network using the tones they could create with them on them. And I have heard the argument. I don't know how true it is, but I don't know why anyone would lie about this. That the Apple Computer Company actually owes its existence to blue boxes because the Steves were making these and selling them, and that's how they got the money to kind of bootstrap their early Apple computer. So this is an illegal device that would let you hack the telephone systems, and so I showed these kind of few examples to just remind us that we have always, as computer enthusiasts, technology people, like there have always been that cutting edge of those people that fall into that category of the description I explained of the competent man who does not, again, man or woman, who isn't just satisfied with like using something as a surface or superficial manner, but actually wants to get into something and understand it. They don't want to make a phone call, they want to control the phone system, right? They don't want to just know that the Social Security system or the census system is using some big computer somewhere to count them. They want their own computer at home that they can play with, right? So that's us, and we're the modern version of that. So we got to think about what that means for us. If 40 years someone might be in some hall like this looking at some things that we're doing, what should they be saying about us? Like what is our role in all this, right? So I did want to make this a little bit more of almost like a sociological talk here. So, just speaking generically, the evolution over time of DIY electronics and hardware hacking and electronics in general, if you think about it, is really all about abstraction. So we don't have to hit or even with that Apple II computer, you didn't have to flip the switches of what byte you wanted to load, set the bits and then hit store. You could just hit a key and load it in, because they abstracted away from what a byte going into the computer was. They abstracted that into a keyboard controller, right? And then that was later abstracted into a GUI. And to bring it back down to electronics things, we would never make, even if we were people who worked with like an AND gate, we would never make an AND gate out of transistors anymore, right? Unless you're like an ASIC designer. But even worse than that, like we probably wouldn't even be using an AND gate, we'd be using an FPGA. Or even worse than that, nowadays we just code everything. If you want to make some little controller or something, you just use an Arduino, because it's just cheap and easy and it's there, right? So we've abstracted all of these things, and then, and the abstraction goes all the way up the chain. I mean, now we've got things like the Raspberry Pi that's basically a computer. It's completely abstracted. You just write, a little program like it's on your desktop computer. So abstraction is really great because we're standing on the shoulders of giants. We don't have to worry about setting the bits in something or worry about what types of transistors are being used in an AND gate or whatever. Like we're abstracted away, and we can just hook things up with jumper wires or type things on a keyboard, and we're able to do great things. So what are the pros of this type of abstraction? Well, the pro is the one first obvious benefit of abstraction is that it gives us a lot of simplicity, right? So has anyone here used an Arduino before? Probably everyone. That it's really simple. I know, I've been doing embedded work, since way back when we had to you'd get a processor and you have to figure out how to hook up the crystal oscillator to it, and then it's like 3 weeks later you're finally getting to load some code on it. But even with all of that knowledge and experience, I still just use Arduinos all the time because I can just grab one and hook some wires up to it and it just automatically works. So that type of simplicity is great, right? That's obviously a benefit. And then another pro, if you will, of abstraction and computer technology in general, but specifically with hardware, is just rapid advancement. If we can all do this standing on the shoulders of giants, we can take something like, let's say, for example, an Arduino, and we can quickly wire that up to do something like, collect GPS information, or, use a Wi-Fi chip to get something on the internet or to pull some data off the internet, which is something which would have been unheard of, like even just 10 years ago in the embedded world, that you would just wire up some stuff on something that a kid could use and be able to do some advanced embedded computing like that, right? So there's simplicity and then rapid advancement that we can just do great things really quickly. So, so that's all well and good, but what are the problems with this type of abstraction? Well, a real big problem is the loss of fundamentals. That because someone just takes this Arduino and plays with it, one thing I've noticed is, has anyone ever heard of an AVR microcontroller? See, I see one hand, but everyone raised their hand for, have I used an Arduino? And Arduino is just an AVR microcontroller. But, back in the day when you were working on an embedded system, you could tell me what microcontroller you're using, how much memory it had, what voltage levels it used. But nowadays, people just say, I have the Arduino. They don't know that it's an AVR microcontroller. They don't know, what interface it has on it, for the most part, right? So we're abstracting away from these fundamentals, and no longer do people know these very basic things, right? So that's not really that big of a problem in a day-to-day use until you have to actually do something a little trickier, right? Like you see problems in the Arduino ecosystem a lot where someone has a problem with a driver or a library to do, let's say to use a NeoPixel or something. It's not working right. It's probably interfering in some way with some other library they're using. And, back in the day, someone would just go in and fix it. But now they're like, it's a library. It's supposed to be a black box, and they throw their hands in the air, right? I don't know what to do. So that loss of fundamentals is not great. It's also not great that even though we have more people working with things like embedded processors and, and doing like hardware hacking things and trying to, get into other systems and how they work using these type of technologies, it's almost like they're often lacking like what are the basic electronics concepts behind them. So, and then I would say a much bigger problem than that. So that's just sort of like an educational philosophical problem, right? A much bigger problem is that as these systems become more abstracted, especially since as they have more of these features now, they're connecting to each other, they're talking to each other. I think my refrigerator has a mime on it doing something very untoward. All right, that's a little bit of Silicon Valley joke there. Anyway, that now we've got a security issue, right? So like with the Apple II, I don't think there was ever an Apple II virus, right? No one ever was using their Apple II and going, I hope no one hacks my Apple II, because it wasn't really connected to anything, and even if it was, no one was trying to get into it, and no one was trying to, when I was using an HC11 to control some LEDs 30 years ago, I was not worried about someone trying to hack it. But now you have a Raspberry Pi in your living room hooked up to your TV doing whatever. You have to worry that thing's basically a Unix box. I mean, is it behind a firewall? Like what, and now, that's kind of a simple example, but whenever you're doing anything now where you're connecting something to something else, which is where our abstraction has reached, right? Like we're now to the point where we're, right now, we're going to talk about it in a minute, but the microcontroller that I love right now has a built-in Wi-Fi interface on it, so it's on the network, right? So who can access it? What can they do with it? What can they change with it, right? So that's something that we all have to start thinking a lot more about. So that's kind of, one of the cons is that, as we know less about what's underneath the covers, and I should say we, like people that kind of use these type of things, it almost falls upon more of the people that really want to engage, the capable man, to know, what could go wrong with this and how do I help that, right? Sort of like the evolution we went through in the 90s with computers, that like now you're going to get viruses, you're going to get worms, you plug it into the internet and dial up on AOL, you're going to have to listen to I've Got Mail, right? So, so this brings about, what I want to make the big takeaway of this talk is the call to action, is that I want, really what I wanted to say was that we need to go beyond, like we work on electronics and we do hardware hacking because it's fun and we want to get into systems, but that we have to do it because we want to learn about how everything works, right? And we have to remember that there's almost if I may engage in a bit of puffery for a moment, there's almost a heroic mission in understanding these systems. Is, if all of a sudden all the, I don't know, whatever certain model of Linksys router out there all start forming some kind of crazy botnet and cause some security breach, those of us who make it our business to stick our nose into all of those routers as soon as we get them home and figure out why they work and look at the firmware, we're going to know maybe before that happens why it happens, and then when it happens we'll be able to fix it. So there's kind of almost like a duty, or at least an ability to help, that comes with being a hardware hacker and understanding how things work, especially as they become more abstracted. And with that, I think, comes the responsibility to teach more people about stuff, right? So most of us in here have probably told people, like, don't join random unsecured Wi-Fi, right? I mean, even though most lay people don't think about that, but probably everyone in this room has, like, told someone, maybe your aunt or mom or someone, don't just go into Starbucks and get on the Wi-Fi, right? Because we're educating people about things that we know a little more detail about, and that's going to become bigger and bigger when someone might hack into your refrigerator or take over your thermostat, your Nest thermostat in your house. Right? So, so I said I wanted to talk a little bit about maybe kind of shift gears here and go into the future a little bit. So has anyone here used the ESP32 processor? A couple people. So oh, you have your badge? Yeah. So awesome. This is a processor that a lot of people out there have like referred to this as the new hot shit processor. So and I'm extremely fond of it. We've used it quite a bit in hacker boxes already. We're going to use it even more. And this processor is an example of some of the things that are, like I said, it demonstrates some of the pros and cons of abstraction, but that I've been talking about. But it's a great example of abstraction because it's just the tiny little microcontroller. You can use it through the Arduino platform. You can use it through other IDE platforms too, but you can treat it just like it's an Arduino chip once you install the board support for it in your Arduino IDE. But it's basically a computer. It's a dual-core processor. I think you can run it up to 180 megahertz in most cases, depending on the implementation. You can see the crazy amount of I/Os it has. It has built-in Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, and it's basically a small computer. You can do amazing things with it. And the actual chip itself, I think, is on the order of a few bucks. And if you get them in like a module format, they're like maybe $9. And they're readily available. They're really amazing, and it's just and so again, the cons are in there that you can use something like this, and it's very easily, you can very easily get into a situation where you're treating all these black boxes that are inside of this thing. You have to treat them like black boxes. We can't know everything about them, but that you could end up with a situation that there's something going on with one of them that's causing a security breach or causing a something to not work correctly. But but the benefit is you can, within minutes, hook one of these up, load some code onto it, and do some really amazing things where you're connecting to the internet, collecting data, transmitting data, doing I/Os. Just like any other microcontroller thing, it has lots of general purpose I/Os. So we really like these processors, and and I think this is an example of where this abstraction is leading us. That that we're using processors like this or like those in the Raspberry Pi, that we're basically getting to a place where our actual hardware, even at like a very low level, low cost perspective, is basically entire computer. They're basically tiny entire computer systems, and that's obviously just going to continue. Like, if I could conjecture for a minute, I would say that an area where this is going to clearly continue is that. As these type of things are connected to cloud services and are able to do things like interpret speech and access AI things, and more importantly, exfiltrate and collect and analyze data, so that any embedded system that you have running might be spying on some aspects of your life, depending on what sensors it has attached to it. That's I think we're going to see more and more and more of that, where these little devices, which could be ubiquitously deployed, are actually just gateways to other more advanced systems that do a lot of things that are going to require a lot of our attention to make sure we keep an eye on. So, and I just wanted to show an example real quick. I know we have at least one person wearing them. That this was the badge that we made for the hacker box from a couple months ago, and we sold a lot of them here. So a lot of people are wearing them around. But we used this ESP32 chip, and we were able to just basically, this is a very simple circuit that's implemented on the circuit board, to just wire it up to a display and some neopixels and a buzzer, and it has some capacitive input keys, and we were able to make basically a platform that was a small computer system, and we put it out there to our membership and to anyone we sold it to online, Made a couple thousand of these, and within like a week, someone ported an NES emulator to it. Someone implemented a packet sniffer on it, and that's what the people that are walking around with the badges are basically. It's listing out all the wireless networks. It finds what their power levels are, and then we add a little chunk of code that, without connecting to any infrastructure, passes messages between them so we can show each other's handles on them. I meant to be wearing mine, but the battery's worn out. So and this is a fairly simple design that just leverages this system on a chip, right? So that's the level of abstraction we're at right now. Is these type of things like the ESP32 are a system on a chip. They've got all of these systems on one chip, super integrated, super low cost. So anyway, so we've been playing around a lot with this ESP32 chip. I think we're going to see some really great things with it. I had mentioned that you can access it from the Arduino IDE. Right now there are an increasing number of libraries, like almost any hardware you could want to attach to it. The Arduino library for it has now been ported to work with the ESP32 cross compiler as well. So, that's really cool that you can, even like this LCD display, we had to make very minimal changes to the existing driver for those TFT LCD displays to communicate to it from the ESP32 and as opposed to the standard Arduino library. So. Yeah, so like I said, at this point, what I wanted to do is not just our typical Q&A at the end of a talk where people are like, I want to ask you about this thing you said, but I wanted to make this more of an opportunity for people to share what their thoughts might be. Like I said, I want to give a little bit of conjecture when I said things are going more cloud-based and using things that leverage the hardware to do lots of more advanced things that are either collective or data processing or whatever. But maybe we could share some of our thoughts on where we think hardware hacking is going, where we would like it to go, where we hope it's going, or anything like that. Like I'd love to hear other people's thoughts. And also in this Q&A, this is back to the more standard Q&A thing. I'm happy to answer any questions about anything related to hardware hacking or electronics or anything like that. See if you can stump me. I'll give you a prize if you can. No, just kidding. Don't stump me. So so when I was told, because we're being filmed too, if you want, you can talk into that mic, or else I'll just repeat your question. So. Did you have something?
Yeah, you can repeat this. But I guess my question is, like when I went to school, I always kind of thought, hardware, doubly, that kind of stuff was going to be the way of the future, and then kind of when we went to the job market, I kind of feel like the last 10 years or more, like software and software hacking and all these things kind of like sucked the air out of the room. And it's like even salary-wise and all these things, very software focused. Do you think there's going to be a reversal, or do you think hardware is going to have more luster in the future, or are we sort of going to be playing some fiddle to software for the rest of my life?
Yeah, all right. So that's a really good question. Basically the question was, let me see if I can just capture it really quickly in one statement. Was that that we sort of have this division, especially you mentioned when you first go to school, am I an electrical engineer or a software engineer, right? And that which of these is more important, or which one is even from a career perspective, which one should I do? And then I think you mentioned that it seems like software is like sucking the air out of the electronics world. And I think another way to put that is that for any piece of electronics you make, especially if it's programmable, like even if it has a simple microcontroller, or especially something like this, you make a piece of hardware, but you can put almost an infinite number of software on it. So I think that's kind of infinite different instances of types of software on it. So that, I think that's probably another way to look at that, is that you make a piece of hardware, especially if it's a universal computing machine, like the things that we all carry around and call computers, or a microcontroller like this, that depending on what peripherals are attached to it, it can run all types of software and do all types of things. So, of course there might be a lot more effort in the software, right? But I think that, my feeling on it is, and I've kind of done both hardware and software development, and I consider myself an embedded engineer, which is someone who sort of does both and deals with software right where it touches the hardware. I don't know that that's necessarily going to change, but I think probably what we're seeing is that as the little bubble that is, whatever percentage hardware and software, where by definition there's less hardware than software because you can have more software on each hardware, that as that bubble gets bigger, it appears that there's more and more software. but the hardware is getting bigger too. And I think that the accessibility to working with hardware, like through things like Arduino or like the ESP32 that we looked at, that really excites me, because the fact that now we've got little kids doing stuff with an Arduino that like I didn't get to do till I was like a junior in college, and I actually understood what a cross compiler was and had a circuit emulator for a microprocessor. That now you see little kids. I mean, I teach a class for high school students where like within a 2-day period, I have them doing really cool stuff with an Arduino, like controlling all sorts of things, taking inputs, making processing decisions, and giving outputs. And that really excites me, because I think we're able to get into the hardware more easily now. Of course, it does have that con of easy in, you're not paying the price, you might not know what you're doing when you're in there, but at least we're doing it. So that's a good concern, I guess. Yeah.
Your comment about abstraction and people not really digging down into the guts as much anymore. I think there was always a very small number of people that did that. And if anything, I would guess the number is even greater now in actual numbers, but maybe smaller in percentage. The abstractions enable a far greater number of people to get into it and do more. The maker community has done some amazing things. I mean, there's an amazing set of hardware out there to enable all of that.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. So the statement was that the abstraction has actually encouraged more people to dig deeper on things. I think that's true. Yeah. So and the number's probably higher, even if, what did you say, maybe the percentage is lower or something. But yeah, there are more people out there playing with hardware for sure, and that's great. I mean, we're very excited about that. I mean, that's I put our logo up here to remind you guys that I work with HackerBoxes, and there's my email address there if you need to contact me. But at HackerBoxes, our goal is to get more people playing with hardware, right? So we encourage that, and we're really excited to see how enthusiastic people are about I think it's really cool how I was able to do this with my last kit, and it's really refreshing, because I think we went through a period there where being a computer enthusiast meant maybe you had a website, or maybe you learned how to do JavaScript or something like that. And it seemed like, I've noticed in every generation, people are like, when I was a kid, people were like, oh, these kids with their Apple II computers, none of them know how to build a radio receiver, right? And then it seemed like when I was first working in industry, my peers were like, oh, they didn't learn, C programming language and assembly like we did. They're all playing with Java, and then there went through a period where it was like, oh, they're just using web browsers. And it's like, I think whatever anyone's working on at that moment, it's like they're at the edge of the bubble, expanding the bubble. And that's great. We just need to keep people excited and remember these things we need to be aware of. Like, as we change paradigms, like as moving from the, independent, individual hardware things like an old style microcontroller to moving to something that can be on the network and talk to other things, that those jumps in paradigm create opportunities for sure. IoT is the big opportunity there, but then create responsibility and and potential threats, like the fact that now our thermostats can get viruses, right? So, yeah, let's have some more ideas. I think we've got still like 20 minutes. So.
I've been on HackerBox for a while now, and I'm just curious. I have two questions. Do you think that, first of all, do you think that HackerBox is ever going to do like something like a radio kit? And the second question would be, where do you see the ESP32 going? Do you think they're going to do, what's expressive?
All right, so there was a two-part question. The first one was, in HackerBoxes, will we ever do software-defined radio? And my answer to that, since I've worked in software-defined radio before, is I would love to do that if we can figure out something that's reasonably accessible to our typical customer and and fits within the budget scale. So it's definitely something we'd be open to. I know one thing, we try not to give too many spoilers in HackerBox because it's a surprise box, but one thing that we've talked about doing is using some basically available like ISM band radio technology, and then having the box focus on modulation techniques, like learning different modulation techniques in a DSP sense. That's a little bit of an advanced topic, but I think if we could figure out a way to make that nicely accessible, we would do that, because that'd be pretty cool. But and then the second question was, where might we go with the ESP32, or what the next step after that might be? I think that's a great question. I hadn't thought about that at all, because it's like the ESP32 is so new and cool. I hadn't thought about what will it be next. I know if I could just like wave a wand at the ESP32 and change something about it, I wish it had video. Like, because that's still kind of the difference between that thing still feels like a microcontroller in like the classic sense of like the 8051 or HC11 or whatever. that versus the things that are more like the system on a chip processors in the Raspberry Pi. Is that the chips you're seeing in like the Raspberry Pi or the other Pi boards or some other things like that, is that they have video capabilities and you can plug them into HDMI, and it changes the whole level of where you're operating, because then you can, you know, run something like a Raspbian on it and then, you know, treat it more like it's a computer and just hook up a keyboard and start typing away. It doesn't feel like it's more of like a hardware target like the ESP32 does. So I don't know if that really fits in with the model of what Espressif is doing with these, but I mean, I think that would be really cool. But I mean, it also seems like that might be a different beast. But also maybe adding more communications. You know, I don't really even know what they'd add now that it has a BLE and Wi-Fi. I don't know what would come next, but you know, I mean, obviously interconnecting things is really a key importance. So.
I think the only thing left would be a transceiver.
Yeah, like maybe something that was a little more like, so you could do a software-defined radio. Is that? Yeah, turn it into a software-defined radio. That might be. Yeah.
Looking over the years, is increasing levels of integration in terms of just how much is on the chip. How much further can they take it? I mean, looking at the ESP, I mean, it's like a room. Well, it used to be a whole room full of equipment.
Right.
Now it's on a little bitty chip.
Yeah.
Further?
I mean, I probably shouldn't try to answer that. I mean, because that's a tough question, or you'd probably know the answer. But it's, I mean, you know, Moore's law tells us that the device scales, meaning how big a transistor is getting smaller and smaller, and then technologies like being able to stack them, and then more importantly, getting the heat out of them. Those things just keep advancing and advancing. So.
I'm not thinking in terms of the physics and how small can they make it. I'm thinking more in terms of the functionality, the modular functionality. I mean, after a certain point, it gets so specialized
right.
that it's no longer as useful.
Right. So that's a good point. Is the specialization issue? Is that you know, once you have something that can actually compute, meaning it can do basic processing and load and store data, which is what a basic processor does, right? Once you can do that, and then once you can interface it to other things, meaning that it has USB or it has Wi-Fi or it has serial ports or whatever, and then it can interface to, you know, sensors and actuators, meaning it has GPIO. What else is there really, right? So that's why I said, you know, I don't know, maybe things are things like video interfaces, camera interfaces. I mean, just because, you know, I guess maybe more, to put it more plainly, what I was thinking in that is, as these things become more capable, making them more able to deal with what we call natural data or natural signals, meaning voice, video, vision, things like that might be the next step. Is that, you know, we need to have the capacity and the interfaces on these things to be able to get audio signals into them, video signals into them, so that they can do, you know, the processing that we're doing right here. Like that's just kind of an I/O problem, right? But I don't know if that's if that might be where we see things moving towards, or. Any other comments or questions, or shoot?
I think as we jump forward in hardware advances, there's a brief pause as people hope to see how much software advances we can get into it. Like the ESP, the last thing I've heard is that they're now putting MicroPython in them and running that OS on it, seeing what they can push with that.
Yeah.
And I think once they hit that limit, then they're going to push for another hardware advance, and it's just this constant over-under battle.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. Basically, what was just stated was that there's, you know, it's sort of like a fit and stall type of thing, where like we make new hardware and then people do more and more with it from a software perspective, and then we make new hardware. And this relates to an earlier question about, you know, why does it seem like there's always more software? Well, because we make some hardware and then we can do a lot of software with it, and then we make some new hardware and we can do a lot of software with it. So yeah, that's really cool. And I think one neat thing we see, which is part of this abstraction, is that, you know, we see the hardware start to move in lots of directions. So for a while we were just making faster processors, putting a little more memory on them, making the caches bigger, blah, blah, blah. And now we're dealing more with like interfaces. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with making the processors more capable of handling more real world things. So they're not just about, you know, packets and key presses and putting stuff on a screen. I think I think a next evolution in computing is going to be dealing with natural data, and you know, I'm not speaking out of school there. I think people have been saying this for like 20 years. That, you know, I know I think Intel had a big like natural data processing research lab like 20 years ago, or maybe 30 years ago. So I think that dealing with things like motion and gesturing and speech, and, you know, doing all the things that our brains do that allow us to communicate very naturally, and that's going to be impressive. You know, there definitely was a big jump that happened with smartphones when they became voice enabled. You know, that now you just pick your phone up. I mean, my my 3-year-old actually says, okay, Google, when he has a question. Like that's kind of crazy. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Which is a little scary, and that's one of those things where like like I was saying earlier, like so the point here was that you can just say something like, okay, Google, and now something's listening. You realize something's listening to you. And those of us that think a lot about computer systems and what that might mean, probably the first time that happened, we were like, I don't like that, right? But lots of other people were like, oh, my phone's talking to me, right? So, and, which is part of what I'm saying, that we have this responsibility now to, to make sure that we keep being the thorn in the side of everyone else and say, maybe it's not so good that your phone's always listening to you, right? So, yeah.
In college, and like my own time, I would learn this with like more maker type hardware. But when I got into the industry and started working, I felt like there was just this big disparity, this big gap between the maker stuff I was working with and like the aftermarket, like manufactured hardware.
Mm-hmm.
It was just tinier and more complex and harder for me to get my hands into. So I was just wondering, like, what suggestions you had to like tackle that kind of stuff.
All right, so this is a great question. The question was, the asker of the question commented that in college they worked with some maker things, and that they were able to get into it and use it, and it was very easy and fun. And that in industry, when we make things, that they're much more complicated and you can't really get into the guts of them and things like that. And this is a little bit what I meant about the accessibility, like kind of like the missing the fundamentals and all of that, is that the part of the problem with dealing with things like, let me just use the example of Arduino, is that it's completely abstracted away when you use an Arduino, that many things are abstracted away, but that there's a processor, and that processor, when you originally have it, there's no code on there for it to run, right? Like the part of the Arduino thing, what makes an Arduino is it has a bootloader in it. So it's always talking to the USB port. It's always waiting to get some more code. So there's already something on there, right? And so, when you spin a circuit board and just put even if it's that same processor, the AVR microcontroller on there, it's not doing anything. It doesn't have anything to talk to, right, when you turn it on. So you have to have something where you can code up the bootloader. And, if it's an industry, let's say just, for example, you're making a thermostat that goes on the wall for Honeywell controls or whatever, and it has that same processor on it that's in the Arduino, the AVR microcontroller, and you're going to need to write a bootloader. You're not going to use an Arduino bootloader because you don't want someone to try to reprogram it from Arduino, plus you want your own bootloader, right? You want something that can manage your flash image areas and things like that. So that's still the problem, is that, we deal with this abstraction and it's easy and fun and everything, but then at some point you do have to step back and get real again when you're making like a real commercial system. And there's a lot of complexity that comes with that, because then you have to start dealing with things like spinning the circuit board and managing clocks and things like that they're just not an issue in the simplified abstracted one that we use in the maker field. But I would say, on the flip side of your concern that like it's harder to get into and it's not as fun when you're doing it at the commercial level, you might not have done that if you hadn't done the fun one. So, if you didn't have the easy road in to see, oh, I do like electronics, I like playing with these things, you might not have pursued a job in doing systems development or electronics design or whatever it is where you've encountered that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's a complicated world. I mean, electronics has become so complicated that, I know I could probably ask you guys, how many TIGs are there in the EE department? There's like 10 or 12 or something like that. So these fellows are also Georgia Tech alumni. Georgia Tech has the largest electrical engineering department in the world, and I think there's 12 TIGs, which are like technical interest groups in the electrical engineering department. Something like that. It's a very large number. It's a disturbingly large number, and you could almost look at it that each one of those is its own separate major, right? So there's like RF and optics and signal processing and communications and circuits and power, electricity, and computer engineering or whatever. There's just so many, and it's like each one is almost its own field now. And so if someone goes to school and studies computer engineering, they're not likely to know how to design an antenna. I mean, they're going to encounter little bits and pieces of it. But, and that's a disturbing thing about a field as it becomes so big and complex, it's very hard to know everything. But then that brings us back to almost this whole issue of the maker thing. If you're someone who actually sits down and makes stuff, like I encounter people that through our work with hacker boxes where they've just been playing with the Arduino, but then we use some little like maybe a radio communication board, and now all of a sudden they've got to concern themselves with how long should the antenna be? What does it mean that it's a quarter of a wavelength? What's a wavelength, right? So all of a sudden they're thinking about RF stuff, or they're trying to interface with something else, but it needs a different clock rate, and they're like, what do you mean I have to have like a transmission line for my clock, right? So, I think you get exposure to these different fields when you've got to actually do it, right? When you do something, like I think a lot of electrical engineers first become, a little more competent about mechanical engineering when they have to put something they've designed in a box, because all of a sudden now they have to know like, where should I place the holes? What shape should they be so they're easy to manufacture? How do I dissipate the heat, right? And so, the whole thing about the maker movement and being a hardware hacker is getting your hands into it and just doing it. And then when you do it, you're going to bump into these walls that are the other things you don't know. You're going to bump into the unknown, right? So, more comments and questions? How many TIGs are there? Cool. Well, I mean, if there's nothing else, maybe we'll just wrap it up for the formality of the presentation. But feel free to hit me up with any other questions or comments or whatever. And I'm spending almost the entire con in the vendor space at the hacker boxes. The logo's right there. I need to turn my shirt around. So stop by and say hi, or if you come up with any questions, let me know, or shoot any ideas or comments or questions to that email address. And thanks for coming. Thanks for being a hardware hacker.